Hey guys, welcome to Just Sleep Stories, and tonight we're doing something truly radical. We're going back to a time before one-click checkout, before 2-day shipping, before you could buy a toilet seat, a blender, and an inflatable kayak at 3 a.m. while lying flat on your back in the dark. Tonight we are talking about the rise of catalogue shopping in 1950s America. That's right. We're going back to the golden age of the glossy, dog-eared, slightly sticky mail-order catalogue. That magnificent brick of printed dreams that showed up on your doorstep and immediately made you feel like you both needed and deserved everything inside it. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. A huge thank you to everyone who suggested this topic. You beautiful, historically curious people. You know who you are. Let's pause for just a second before we dive in, because you need to understand what we're actually talking about here. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to flip through a 500-page catalogue and genuinely believe that a new vacuum cleaner could change your life? Did housewives in 1953 sit at the kitchen table circling items with a stubby pencil and feel the exact same dopamine rush you get from adding things to your cart at midnight? What did it smell like when that catalogue first arrived? Could you actually order a prefab house from a catalogue? A gun? A wedding dress? A husband's birthday gift that he would absolutely hate, but accept graciously anyway? Did people fight over the catalogue the same way families fight over the TV remote today? And what on earth happened when the wrong thing showed up in the mail 6 weeks later? Congratulations. You've just woken up in suburban America, 1952. There's a Ford in the driveway, a pot roast in the oven, and a brand new Sears Roebuck catalogue on the front porch. It weighs more than your youngest child. You have no idea what's about to happen to your bank account. Let's set the scene. It is a perfectly ordinary Tuesday in 1953. You're in the kitchen. The radio is on. Something smells like coffee and ambition. And then a soft thump on the front porch. You already know what it is before you even open the door. The Sears Roebuck catalogue has arrived. Not a pamphlet, not a flyer, a catalogue. A thick, glossy, impossibly heavy slab of printed possibility that lands in your hands like a delivered promise. It smells like fresh ink and new plastic, and the faint chemical optimism of the post-war boom. You carry it inside with both arms, the way you'd carry a baby or a very important casserole dish, and you set it down on the kitchen table. For a moment, you just look at it, because you already know this is going to cost you something. You just don't know how much yet. The cover alone takes a full minute. A smiling woman in a pastel house dress stands in a kitchen that is aggressively, almost offensively clean. Everything in that kitchen is the right colour. Everything matches. The countertop has nothing on it except one perfectly placed bowl of fruit, which is not how any real kitchen with real people in it has ever looked. Not once in all of human history. But you study it anyway, because this is the catalogue's first move, showing you a life adjacent to yours, just slightly better lit, just slightly more organised, just slightly more in possession of the correct mixing bowls. You flip to the table of contents. This is a mistake. The table of contents is 2 full pages long and contains categories you didn't know you needed to be aware of. Outdoor furniture, automotive accessories, musical instruments, plumbing fixtures, ladies' foundations, men's dress shirts, children's sleepwear, sporting goods, floor coverings, and something listed simply as electrical goods, which sounds ominous but turns out to be everything from light switches to radios to an electric blanket that the description promises will change the way you think about winter. You circle the table of contents, not anything on it specifically, just the table of contents itself, out of enthusiasm, out of respect. Here is something that the internet age has quietly taken from us and never properly apologised for. the experience of a catalogue page as a physical object. Each page has weight. Each photograph was taken by a real person who set up a real scene with real objects arranged under real lights. And when you look at a photograph of a chrome percolator on page 47, you are looking at something that someone decided to make beautiful. The catalogue was, among other things, a design document. Every item was described in language that treated ordinary things with quiet seriousness. A 3/4-inch paintbrush was not just a brush. It was described with specific bristle information and handle length and use case, as if the decision to purchase this particular brush was one that deserved the same deliberation as, say, selecting a doctor. And so you sit down, the coffee's going cold and you do not care. One of the children is asking you something and you have temporarily lost the ability to hear it. You're on page 12, which is still technically the front matter, and already something on page 12 has earned a small pencil dot in the margin. Not a circle, not yet, just a dot, indicating interest, indicating that you are a person who noticed this thing and are reserving the right to return to it later. This is how it begins, not with one purchase, not with one decision, with a dot. A tiny, entirely harmless pencil dot that is the first step on a path that ends with a package on the porch 6 weeks from now, and a mild but genuine feeling of triumph at having caused something good to happen through the simple and ancient act of wanting it and writing it down. The catalogue has arrived. You're already somewhere on page 14. The coffee is cold. You have never been more comfortable. Let's take a step back and talk about what the catalogue actually was, because calling it a shopping book is like calling the ocean a puddle. By the early 1950s, the Sears Roebuck catalogue had been arriving in American homes for over half a century, but the post-war era transformed it into something almost spiritual. It was a wish book. That is what people actually called it. Not a marketing term, not an advertising slogan, but a name that came organically from the people flipping its pages at kitchen tables and on porches across rural and suburban America. Inside those pages, everything you could possibly need, and an enormous amount of things you absolutely did not need, was laid out in neat rows with descriptions written in the kind of confident, cheerful prose that made even a replacement furnace filter sound like an exciting lifestyle opportunity. To understand why Americans were so thoroughly, helplessly obsessed with catalogues in the 1950s, you have to understand what the 1950s felt like from inside. The war was over, people were building things, they were buying houses and filling them with furniture and having children and equipping kitchens and garages and bedrooms and nurseries. There was a collective momentum to the era, a sense that life was supposed to be getting better in measurable, acquirable ways, and the catalogue was the physical embodiment of that idea. It said, here are the things, here are all the things, here is what better looks like, and here is the price, and here is how you get it. The fall edition and the spring edition arrived twice a year like secular holidays. Families in rural areas, and there were still a great many families in rural areas, planned around the catalogue's arrival the way you might plan around a visit from a relative who always brings something good. Children knew which section was theirs. Fathers had their sections, mothers had theirs, and also everyone else's, because mothers were generally managing the household economy, and therefore had both the most need and the most complicated relationship with a document that simultaneously solved problems and created them. What made it so addictive, beyond the obvious appeal of wanting things, was the completeness of it. The catalogue didn't curate. It didn't edit down to a tasteful selection of aspirational items for a target demographic. It included everything. You could be looking at silk evening gloves on one page and septic tank equipment on the next. And somehow this felt right, felt honest, felt like a document that understood that real life contained both of these things and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. There was something deeply democratic about that comprehensiveness. Nobody was too fancy for this catalogue, and nobody was too practical. It served you wherever you were. And then there was the photography. By the 1950s, catalogue photography had developed its own distinct visual language. Clean white backgrounds, items arranged with careful informality, models posed in gentle domestic scenes that suggested rather than demanded. A woman sitting at a vanity table wearing a quilted robe wasn't selling you the robe so much as selling you the specific quality of quietness that the robe implied, and you bought it. Not always with money, not right away, but mentally. You bought the scene, you circled it, you folded down the corner of the page, you returned to it 3 days later and looked at it again. The catalogue was less a shopping tool than a catalogue of possible selves. Each page was a proposal. You could be the person who has this. And in 1953 America, when the world had recently been very dark and was now trying hard to be very bright, the idea of being the person who has this was not a small thing. It was hope, printed on slightly glossy paper, delivered twice a year, for free. If catalogue shopping had a king, it wore the crown of Sears, Roebuck and Company. By the 1950s, Sears wasn't just a retailer, it was an institution, the kind of name that sat alongside words like family, church and baseball in the American imagination. Founded in the 1880s by Richard Warren Sears, who was originally a railroad agent who discovered he could sell watches by mail and apparently never stopped, the company had spent decades quietly colonizing the American home. By the time the post-war boom roared into gear, Sears was producing a catalogue that ran to over 600 pages, covered everything from power tools to perfume, and was mailed to tens of millions of households across the country. Not sold, mind you, mailed, free, straight to your door. As if the company was saying, "Here, let us bring the store to you because you clearly cannot be trusted to not want things." Richard Sears had a gift that is rarer than it sounds. He understood that people don't just buy products, they buy the feeling that buying the right product produces. In his early years, he was writing catalogue copy himself. Long, enthusiastic, slightly breathless descriptions of watches and rings and novelties that made even the most ordinary items sound like they had been specifically manufactured to solve a problem you'd had your whole life without realizing it. He was essentially writing ad copy at a time before advertising was a formal industry, and he was very good at it. The company grew, then it grew more, then it grew in a way that required a larger word than growth. By the 1950s, Sears had physical stores as well as the catalogue, but the catalogue remained the heart of the enterprise, the thing that reached into places no store could go, the thing that kept Sears present in millions of homes during the weeks and months between purchases. The catalogue was a kind of permanent houseguest, always somewhere nearby, always ready to be consulted, never requiring anything from you except your attention. It sat on the kitchen counter or the coffee table or the shelf in the mudroom, getting softer at the edges, developing a patina of use, looking more like a family possession than a commercial document. Which was, of course, exactly the intention. The scale of the Sears operation in this era is genuinely difficult to hold in your mind. At its peak, the Sears catalogue employed warehouses the size of small cities, with order-picking systems and conveyor belts and armies of workers filling orders with a speed and precision that were considered engineering marvels of their time. An order placed by a farmer in Nebraska in September might be picked, packed, and handed to the railway post office within a day. The railway would carry it across the country. A rural carrier would drive it down a dirt road, and a woman in a kitchen would receive it and feel, for a moment, connected to the whole enormous machinery of American commerce, connected to something big through a very small brown paper parcel. It wasn't just the products. Sears sold trust. Over decades, the company built a reputation for standing behind what it sold. The money-back guarantee was real and meant something to people in an era when most retail transactions were final. If you ordered something and it wasn't right, Sears would make it right. That promise, kept often enough to be believed, was worth more than any single product in the catalogue. It was the reason you kept ordering, the reason the catalogue kept arriving, the reason Sears, for the better part of a century, lived inside the American home like a friendly, reliable, slightly expensive member of the family. Now, Sears had a competitor, a serious one. And before you've heard the name and then immediately forgotten it by morning, let's give Montgomery Ward its proper due, because in the 1950s, Ward's catalogue was sitting on kitchen tables across America right alongside Sears, and the rivalry between these two companies was the kind of slow, quiet, Midwestern competition that never involved screaming but absolutely involved feelings. Montgomery Ward was actually older than Sears. Founded in 1872 by Aaron Montgomery Ward, it had the distinction of being the very first mail-order catalogue company in American history. Ward figured out before anyone else that rural Americans were being gouged by local general stores, and that if someone could connect farmers directly to goods at fair prices through the mail, that someone would become very, very wealthy. He was right. For decades, Wards and Sears traded blows in the catalogue marketplace, each one trying to out-feature, out-price and out-charm the other, and the American consumer sat in the middle, living their best life, penciling circles around refrigerators in both catalogues just to compare. Aaron Montgomery Ward's original insight was almost poetically simple. He noticed that farmers were paying inflated prices at rural general stores because the farmers had no alternative, no way to compare prices, no access to the wholesale markets that supplied city shoppers. The solution? Cut out every middleman, buy direct from manufacturers in bulk, and sell to customers through the mail at prices the local store could not match. Ward's first catalogue, issued in 1872, was a single sheet of paper listing 163 items. Within a decade, it had grown into a book. Within 2 decades, it was an empire. By the 1950s, Ward's was Sears' most credible rival. It was slightly more conservative in its design aesthetic, a little less aggressive in its copy, a little more restrained in its claims, and it had a loyal customer base that had been with the company for generations. There were families who had shopped Ward's since their grandparents' time and felt a mild but genuine tribal loyalty to it, the way people feel about sports teams or brand of ketchup. They would look at the Sears catalogue, acknowledge its merits with a quiet fairness, and then order from Ward's anyway because that was simply what you did. The rivalry produced real benefits for consumers. When Sears lowered a price, Ward's noticed and responded. When Ward's improved its credit terms, Sears paid attention. The competition kept both companies honest and innovative in ways that a monopoly never encourages. New product lines, better guarantees, improved order processing, many of these advances happened because one company was watching the other and did not want to be behind. This is, incidentally, the part of economic competition that actually works the way textbooks say it does, which is not always how it goes, so it's worth noting. Ward's also had a moment of genuine cultural glory that Sears never matched. They invented Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, not metaphorically, literally. In 1939, a Ward's copywriter named Robert L. May wrote the story as a promotional colouring book for the holiday season. 6 million copies were distributed that year. After the war, it was made into a song, and then, eventually, a television special that has been watched by every American child born since 1964. Montgomery Ward gave the world Rudolph. They went bankrupt in 2000. These two facts exist simultaneously, without apology, in the historical record. You're sitting in a wooden chair. The kitchen is warm. Outside, it's October in Ohio or Iowa or Kansas. Take your pick, and the trees are doing their annual dramatic act. The catalogue is open in your lap, and you're on page 112, which is deep enough into the housewares section that you've started to feel a vague but powerful need for a new set of mixing bowls. You don't need new mixing bowls. Your current mixing bowls are fine. They've been fine for 9 years, but these ones have a little pouring spout on the side, and the photograph makes them look so clean and so purposeful, sitting on that anonymous catalogue kitchen counter, that something in your chest shifts slightly, and you reach for the stubby pencil you keep tucked behind your ear specifically for this moment. This is what the wish book does to you. This is its power. It doesn't sell you products. It sells you a version of your own life in which every object in your kitchen is exactly right. The ritual of catalogue browsing was its own art form. Unlike shopping in a store where you went in with a list and came out with those things plus a candy bar, catalogue browsing had no inherent endpoint. There was no closing time, no checkout line, no physical fatigue from walking. You could browse for 20 minutes or 3 hours, and both felt appropriate, and neither one felt like a failure. The catalogue had its own internal rhythm, dense product sections followed by lifestyle photographs followed by more products, and reading it was less like shopping and more like reading a magazine that also happened to contain everything you needed. People developed personal browsing habits that were as specific and idiosyncratic as any other domestic ritual. Some started from the front and worked methodically through. Others went straight to their section, the one that belonged to them, and spent most of their time there before taking a brief tour of the rest. Some people browsed the catalogue the way you browse a museum, not to buy anything specific, just to see what existed, to stay current with the world of available things. Children, of course, operated by their own system, which involved flipping directly to the toy section and treating every page as a personal referendum on what their life was missing. The pencil was essential, not a pen. A pen was too permanent, too committed. A pencil said, "I am interested, I am considering, I have not made any decisions." A pencil circle around an item was a conversation with your future self. It said, "Future you, look at this. Future you should think about this. Future you gets to decide." And future you, arriving at the page 3 days later with fresh eyes, might circle it more firmly, or might erase the original circle and feel a mild but real sense of financial virtue at having talked yourself out of something. Either outcome was satisfying. The catalogue gave you choices and then it gave you the pleasure of navigating them, which is, if you think about it, one of the better things life has to offer. By November, a well-used wish book had developed a whole archaeological record of its owner's desires. Pages were turned down at the corners. Some pages had 2 or 3 generations of pencil marks, some erased and recircled, some just circled once with a kind of authority that meant the decision had been made, and the only remaining step was telling the household budget about it. The catalogue at this stage was less a commercial document and more a personal one, a map of what you wanted marked up in your own hand, in the warmth of your own kitchen, entirely on your own terms. Here is where the real psychological endurance sport begins. You have circled your items. You have filled out the order form, a small, densely printed piece of paper that requires information at a level of specificity that makes a modern tax return look casual. Item number, catalogue page number, colour, size, quantity, price per unit, shipping cost, total amount enclosed, and then you write a cheque. An actual cheque, by hand, in ink, for the exact amount, and you fold it carefully into the envelope with the order form, seal it, stamp it, and hand it to the postal worker with the reverence of someone mailing a letter to the future, which, in a sense, you are. 'Cause now you wait 6 to 8 weeks. That was the standard promise, and it was honoured with the same loose confidence with which someone says they'll be there in 5 minutes. You wait. Every day you hear the mail truck. Every day you stand at the window. Every day it is not your thing. The waiting was not incidental. The waiting was, in its own strange way, part of the product. There is a principle in psychology, something behavioural economists have studied and named in several different ways, about the relationship between anticipation and pleasure, and the basic finding is that wanting something for a long time can make receiving it more satisfying than getting it immediately. The catalogue industry of 1950s America ran on this principle without knowing its name. Every day of waiting was another day of imagining the item in your home, on your body, in use. You had purchased the dress weeks ago, in a real financial sense, but you had also been imagining wearing the dress for 6 weeks, and by the time it arrived, you had already lived a small fictional life in which you owned it. The actual delivery was confirmation of a reality you'd already half created. Of course, this emotional mechanism worked perfectly only if the item was what you expected. And sometimes it was. Sometimes you opened the parcel and held the thing up, and it was exactly right. The colour was the colour in the photograph. The size was the size you ordered. The quality was what the description implied, and the satisfaction of that moment was genuine and warm and worth the 6 weeks. You set it on the kitchen table for a while just to look at it. You showed it to people. You mentioned, with a casualness that did not quite conceal your pleasure, that it had just arrived. But sometimes the dress was beige. Sometimes the size was technically correct, but the cut was designed for a body that did not belong to you or anyone you'd ever met. Sometimes the thing arrived with a small crack in it, or in a colour the catalogue had called dusty blue, but which was, in the unforgiving light of your kitchen, clearly green. And in those moments, the 6 weeks of waiting curdled into something that felt less like disappointment and more like a specific kind of mild betrayal. The kind you don't make a fuss about because it isn't really fuss-worthy. You just carry it quietly and remember it the next time you're deciding between Sears and Ward's. Still, you ordered again. Because the alternative, not ordering, not circling, not waiting, was a version of life that felt smaller and flatter and less interesting. The catalogue had given you something to look forward to, which is never nothing, even if the dress was green. Let's spend a moment with the order form because it deserves its own quiet tribute. In the age before digital carts, before autofill, before the website that already knows your address because you bought socks there 18 months ago, ordering from a catalogue required you to manually translate your desires into a small printed grid and do it correctly on the first try. The form asked for your name, address, and account number, and if you didn't have an account number, you first had to apply for one, which meant a separate form, which arrived by mail, which took 2 weeks. Assuming you navigated that particular bureaucratic warm-up act, you then had to list each item by its catalogue number, double-check the page reference, specify colour from a list of colour codes printed in 8-point font, indicate size using a different code, calculate the price, add applicable shipping charges based on a weight table printed in the back of the catalogue, and then add up all of it by hand using pencil arithmetic. Get it wrong, and you'd receive the wrong item, or nothing at all. Or a very polite letter explaining that the item was out of stock and would you accept a substitute in beige. The catalogue number system was its own quiet masterpiece of complexity. Each item had a unique identifier, a string of letters and numbers that looked like a code from a spy novel, and was, in practice, about equally decipherable without specific training. A catalogue number might look something like 47K3261-B, which referred to item 47K3261 in colourway B, which was the colour the catalogue called Wedgwood Blue, and which appeared in the photograph as a calm, sophisticated shade, and which would arrive at your door looking, in certain lights, almost exactly like that. Almost. The -B was important. If you wrote -A by accident, you got the dusty rose, which was nobody's fault but yours, and the return process awaited you with its own particular brand of paperwork joy. And the arithmetic. The catalogue shipping weight tables were printed in a font sized for people with the visual acuity of a hawk and the patience of a saint. You found the weight of your first item, located the column for your shipping zone, found the applicable rate, wrote it in the box, then repeated this for every item on your order. If you were ordering 7 things, you did 7 individual shipping calculations and then summed them. If your addition was wrong, you enclosed the wrong amount, and the order would be delayed while a human being at the Sears processing facility in Chicago reconciled your check with your order form and either billed you the difference or refunded it, both of which involved more mail. People developed systems. Dedicated catalogue orderers had their methods. Always use a ruler to read across the weight table. Always double-check the colour code. Always write the item number twice, once in pencil first, once in pen when you're sure. Always add up the column twice. These were household skills, passed from parent to child the way you'd pass on any practical knowledge, through demonstration and gentle correction when someone's first independent order arrived with a green dress instead of a blue one. There was a genuine satisfaction in getting it right. Sliding a correctly completed order form into an envelope with a correctly written check, and knowing, with calm certainty, that you had done the thing properly, was the 1950s equivalent of watching a progress bar complete. Small, real, and yours. If catalogue shopping had an unsung hero, it was the rural mail carrier, not the glamorous downtown postal worker, not the guy with the truck and the scanner and the little trolley. The rural mail carrier, the one who drove their own car down unpaved roads in freezing January to deliver packages to farms 12 miles from the nearest town. In the 1950s, rural free delivery, the postal service policy that extended mail service to the countryside, was the infrastructure backbone of the entire catalogue economy. Without it, none of this works. Without a reliable person willing to drive a cold car down a muddy road and put a box on a porch, there is no Sears empire, no wish book, no stubby pencil circling mixing bowls. The mail carrier was, in many rural homes, a genuine community figure. They knew when a package was coming before you did. They knew what you ordered because your return address label said Sears and your package was shaped like a toaster. They said nothing because they were professionals, but they absolutely knew. Rural Free Delivery, known as RFD, was established by the United States Postal Service in the 1890s after considerable political fighting, because the idea of delivering mail to every farm in rural America was considered by some to be wildly impractical, and by others to be long overdue. The farmers, who were paying good money to maintain post office boxes in town and driving miles to retrieve their mail, had opinions about this debate and expressed them with the characteristic low-key fury of people who have been inconvenienced for too long and have finally decided to write their congressman. RFD won. The routes were established. Carriers were hired. By the 1950s, the rural mail carrier was an institution. Routes could be 70 or 80 miles long, covering dozens of farms and small homesteads. A carrier might start at 6 in the morning and finish in late afternoon, working through snow and mud and summer heat, delivering not just letters and catalogues, but parcels of every size and description. This was before the era of the dedicated package delivery truck. The mail carrier took everything. This included live animals. The Postal Service, in a policy that seems wild in retrospect but made perfect practical sense at the time, would deliver baby chicks and other small livestock through the mail. Farms ordered them from hatcheries. The post office delivered them. The mail carrier arrived at a farmhouse with a box that made sounds. This was normal. The relationship between rural families and their mail carriers was intimate in the way that only service relationships in small communities become. The carrier knew if you were expecting something important. They knew if a package had been damaged in transit and would hold it up at the route's start point rather than deliver something broken. They sometimes, if a farm was far off the main road and the package was large, would carry it to the door rather than leave it in the roadside box. This was not a policy. It was just a person being decent to another person in a cold car on a muddy road, because they had been doing this route for 11 years and they knew your name. The catalogue economy relied on the postal service the way the postal service relied on the catalogue economy. Sears alone was responsible for an enormous percentage of rural parcel mail volume. The two institutions grew together, each one making the other more useful and more necessary, in a working partnership that was never formally acknowledged but was understood by everyone involved. Let's go to the kitchen section, because this is where the catalogue did its most dangerous and seductive work. By the 1950s, the American kitchen was being aggressively reimagined by post-war prosperity, and the catalogue was the primary vehicle through which most Americans were introduced to the idea that their kitchen could and should be better. Electric mixers, automatic percolators, pressure cookers, toasters with 2 slots then 4 slots, waffle irons shaped like hearts, refrigerators with actual freezer compartments. For a woman who had grown up cooking on a wood stove or managing a wartime kitchen with rationed everything, flipping to the appliance pages of a 1953 Sears catalogue was an experience somewhere between a fever dream and a religious vision. There it was, a chrome electric range with push-button burner controls and a built-in timer. It cost more than your husband made in 2 months. You circled it anyway. You had plans. The post-war kitchen was a project, not just in the physical sense of renovation or purchasing, but in the philosophical sense of what a kitchen was supposed to be and do and say about the family it served, television and magazines. And now the catalogue were all collaborating on a vision of the American kitchen as a gleaming, efficient, modern place where a well-equipped woman produced excellent meals with minimal apparent effort. The appliances were the tools of this performance, and the catalogue sold them with an enthusiasm that made you feel that the failure to own a stand mixer was, at minimum, a minor domestic oversight. The electric stand mixer deserves special mention. By the 1950s, a good stand mixer represented the highest form of kitchen aspiration available to a middle-class American household. The catalogue descriptions made them sound almost architectural, sturdy and precise, and capable of producing results that your old hand mixer simply could not deliver. The photographs showed bowls full of glossy, perfectly whipped cream, pillowy batter, bread dough that appeared to have achieved a state of spiritual readiness. You looked at these photographs and you felt the inadequacy of your own creations, which were fine but were not that, and which might, with the right equipment, be closer to that. This is the catalogue's most reliable trick, making you feel the gap between what you have and what you could have, and then immediately offering to close it. Refrigerators were the grand statement appliances of the era. The transition from an icebox still present in some homes at the start of the decade to a proper electric refrigerator was a genuine quality of life transformation, and the catalogue treated it as such. The descriptions were almost reverential. Automatic defrost, humidity-controlled crisper drawer, a door shelf specifically designed for butter, as if the butter's comfort had been a primary engineering concern. The freezer compartment was presented as a modern miracle, which it functionally was. The ability to keep food genuinely frozen at home, to buy in quantity and store safely, to have ice without ordering it from a truck, this changed how families ate and shopped and planned, and the catalogue was right there to sell you every component of the new reality, one glossy page at a time. The kitchen section of the catalogue was also, in ways nobody quite stated outright, an argument. It argued that the quality of a kitchen's equipment was a meaningful reflection of the household standards. It argued that upgrading your percolator was not frivolous but sensible. It argued with every chrome-finished, push-button illustrated page that a better kitchen was a better life, and that all that stood between you and that better life was the order form at the back of the book. You're tired? Of course you are. You've been up since 6, the kids need everything, the kitchen has opinions about your organisational system, and somewhere between breakfast and dinner, someone knocked over the lamp. But tonight you have the catalogue open to the bedroom section, and for a few quiet minutes before everyone needs you again, you're looking at bedroom furniture that exists in a dimension of perfect cleanliness and total silence. Matching sets, headboards with gentle curves, bedspreads in colours the catalogue describes as dusty rose or colonial blue, as though your bedroom could be an aesthetic statement rather than the room where you mostly collapse. Pillowcases sold in sets of 4, curtains with delicate embroidery at the hem, a vanity mirror with a little padded stool. In the catalogue world, people in bedrooms are always rested, always dressed in pressed pyjamas, always reaching serenely for a glass of water on a nightstand that matches everything else in the room. This is not your life, but it could be. 16 easy payments. The bedroom furniture section of a 1950s catalogue was a particular kind of fantasy, quieter and more private than the kitchen section's bright chrome ambitions, more intimate than the living room's performance of respectability. The bedroom was the room that nobody saw. It was the room that was entirely yours, theoretically, which made wanting it to be exactly right feel slightly more justifiable than wanting the perfect waffle iron. You couldn't help what the living room looked like exactly, because the living room was a public room and subject to the negotiating forces of family taste and budget, and the opinions of people who visited. The bedroom was different. The bedroom was the room where you got to want exactly what you wanted and feel no particular obligation to explain it to anyone. Bedroom sets, the matched headboard, dresser, chest of drawers, and nightstand combination were the prestige purchase of the bedroom section. They were sold with the argument, stated or implied, that furniture that matched was fundamentally better than furniture that didn't, not just aesthetically but practically, as if owning mismatched nightstands introduced a subtle, structural instability into your household that coordinated pieces would resolve. The catalogue helpfully offered several complete sets at different price points, each one photographed in a room of such serene order that it functioned more as an emotional argument than a product demonstration. Bedding was where many families actually shopped in the bedroom section, because bedding was affordable, replaceable, and subject to genuine wear. A new bedspread was the fastest and cheapest way to make a bedroom feel different, and the catalogue offered dozens of options in styles ranging from the plainly practical to the frankly decorative. Chenille was popular, that dense textured fabric with its slightly fuzzy surface and its ability to look both cosy and tidy simultaneously, which is a harder combination to achieve than it sounds. Candlewick patterns, floral prints, solids in colours named with the same gentle optimism as paint chips, morning mist, garden green, harvest gold. Sheets came in cotton, or a new and exciting synthetic blend that the catalogue promised was easier to care for and dried faster, which mattered more than it sounds in an era before tumble dryers were universal. Pillowcases in sets, mattress pads described in terms that made a thin layer of quilted cotton sound like an engineering achievement, and the electric blanket, a genuine post-war innovation presented in catalogue prose with the breathless enthusiasm usually reserved for moon landings. An electric blanket, a blanket with settings, a blanket that remembered it was winter so you didn't have to. You circled it every year for 3 years before finally ordering it, and then you kept it for 22 years, and it was worth every instalment payment. The bedroom section closed with a quiet promise. Sleep, and sleep well, in a room that is yours, in bedding that is clean and soft and chosen, surrounded by furniture that matches. It is a modest promise by the standards of what the catalogue usually claimed, but in the middle of a busy decade, in a house full of noise and need, the idea of a room that was simply, peacefully yours was not modest at all. It was everything. Now here is where catalogue shopping required a particular kind of optimism that borders on the heroic. Clothing, by mail, sight unseen, touch unfelt, draped on a model whose proportions have been gently idealised by whoever was in charge of the photography. You look at the photograph. The dress is lovely, a navy shirtwaist with white buttons down the front and a nipped-in waist that suggests a woman with no interest in sitting down after lunch. The description says washable cotton, roomy cut, available in sizes 12 through 20. You order a 16. 6 weeks later, a flat brown parcel arrives, and you open it at the kitchen table with the careful anticipation of someone diffusing something small but potentially upsetting. You unfold the dress. It is navy. It has white buttons. The waist is not nipped. The roomy cut is doing a lot of work. The cotton has a quality that the catalogue described as crisp, and you would describe as capable of standing up on its own. You hold it against yourself in the bathroom mirror and make a face that your reflection understands completely. Here is the fundamental problem with ordering clothes by mail in the 1950s, and it is a problem so obvious that it seems almost rude to point out. You cannot try anything on. This sounds simple. It is not simple. The entire architecture of clothing retail, the fitting room, the three-way mirror, the patient salesperson who says it looks wonderful when it doesn't quite, exists because clothes are not neutral objects. They interact with bodies in ways that photographs cannot predict and descriptions cannot capture. The catalogue knew this. The catalogue tried. The size charts were detailed, the measurements were specific, and the instructions for taking your own measurements were printed with the kind of careful clarity usually reserved for operating heavy machinery. Measure the fullest part of the bust. Measure the natural waist. Measure the hips at the fullest point, which will be approximately 7 to 9 inches below the natural waist. This is either obvious or impossible, depending entirely on whether you have ever tried to hold a tape measure against your own hip while reading a number upside down in a mirror. And even if you measured correctly, even if you consulted the size chart with genuine diligence and ordered the exact recommended size, what arrived was still a garment made to a standard that averaged across millions of bodies and fit none of them perfectly. The catalogue dress fit the catalogue woman, who was a statistical construct, a shape built from averages, generous in no particular direction. She existed in the photograph with easy confidence and a smile that said she had never once stood in a bathroom mirror making a face. You envied her. You also knew she wasn't real. Men had a somewhat easier time of it in the clothing section, mostly because men's clothing in this era operated on simpler parameters, neck size, sleeve length, chest measurement, and because the cultural expectations for fit were considerably more forgiving. A man's catalogue shirt that was slightly too large was just a shirt. A woman's catalogue dress that was slightly too large was an occasion for feelings. This is not fair. It is simply how the 1950s worked, and the catalogue reflected it faithfully. The children's clothing section was its own particular adventure. Children's sizes were theoretically based on age, which everyone who has ever known an actual child understands to be a deeply unreliable indicator of anything. A size 7 might fit your 7-year-old perfectly, or it might arrive looking like a costume for a different and more compact child entirely. Mothers who ordered children's clothes from the catalogue learned quickly to order up and hem, which introduced a secondary craft skill into the household that nobody had specifically asked for but everyone eventually acquired. And yet the clothing section was never unpopular. Because the prices were genuinely good, the selection was genuinely wide, and every season the catalogue offered something that felt new, that felt like the outside world arriving at your door with a suggestion about who you might be this year, even if the dress wasn't quite right, even if the waist never nipped. There was still the next catalogue. There was still next season. The pencil was still behind your ear. Let's be honest. The catalogue served men too, but men interacted with it differently. Where women lingered, turned pages back, cross-referenced and made careful lists, men tended to open the catalogue to one specific section, find one specific item, and either order it immediately or close the book and say they were thinking about it. The tools section was sacred. rows of wrenches, drill bits in sets, levels and squares and things with names like Plumb Bob and Ratchet Set that sounded like characters from a Western novel. A man could stand in his garage, hold a catalogue open to the power tool section, and feel a quiet but genuine contentment that is difficult to explain and probably shouldn't be probed too deeply. The suits were a different matter. Catalogue suits were functional, sturdy, available in grey, navy, or brown, and photographed on men who appeared to have no necks. They fit the way catalogue clothing usually fit. Fine, mostly. Good enough for the office. Acceptable at the kind of party where no one was going to say anything. The tools section of the Sears catalogue deserves its own moment of genuine appreciation because it was a masterwork of practical completeness. By the 1950s, the post-war American man had acquired a garage, and the garage required filling. Not just with a car, but with the equipment necessary to maintain the car, maintain the house, and theoretically complete the various projects that had been planned since the moving boxes were unpacked and had not yet been started. The catalogue understood this gap between intention and execution, and served it faithfully with pages of hand tools, power tools, workbench equipment, and organisational systems for storing all of the above. A Craftsman wrench set sold under the Sears House brand with a lifetime guarantee, meaning if it broke, Sears replaced it, no questions, no receipt required, was the kind of purchase that felt both practical and mildly philosophical. You were not just buying a wrench, you were investing in the idea of yourself as someone who fixes things. The Craftsman brand became, over time, something that crossed the line from product into identity. Craftsman tools were what a certain kind of serious, capable American man used, and owning them was a statement about the kind of household you intended to run. A garage with a pegboard of Craftsman tools, organised by size and type with the silhouettes drawn on the board so you could see immediately what was missing, was not just a workshop. It was a declaration. It said, "Things break here, and I fix them." The catalogue provided both the tools and the implicit aspiration in a single transaction. The watch section occupied a specific and tender place in the men's catalogue experience. Watches were the prestige personal item for men in this era, the one piece of jewellery a working man could wear without comment, the one object that straddled utility and vanity without embarrassing either. The catalogue offered watches at every price point, from the purely functional to the quietly impressive, and the Christmas watch was an institution unto itself. Every year, sometime in October or November, someone in a household would turn to the watch pages with serious intent. The selection would be studied, specifications would be compared, a decision would be made, wrapped in the careful secrecy of gift-giving, and an order form would be completed with a level of precision usually reserved for important financial documents. On Christmas morning, a small box would be unwrapped, and a watch would be lifted out and held up and admired, and the man receiving it would put it on his wrist and look at it for a moment, before looking at whoever gave it to him, and that look said several things at once, all of them warm. The automotive section was where catalogue shopping intersected with one of the great American passions of the post-war era. Car parts, accessories, floor mats, seat covers, windshield visors, chrome trim pieces, and enough technical equipment to perform minor mechanical surgery on a 1950 Ford. The descriptions were written for people who knew what they were doing and appreciated being addressed as such. No hand-holding, no reassuring metaphors, just specifications and part numbers and the quiet confidence of a document that assumed you were capable of knowing what you needed. This was, in its own way, a form of respect. The catalogue didn't condescend to the men in its automotive section. It met them where they were and gave them what they came for. Every child in 1950s America who had access to a Sears catalogue knew exactly what the toy section looked like. because they had looked at it so many times that the pages had developed a soft, finger-worn quality unique to that part of the book. The toy section arrived in the full catalogue like a gift inside a gift. It was dense, illustrated, and completely overwhelming in the best possible way. Cap guns and cowboy sets, baby dolls with eyes that opened and closed, train sets with enough track to go around the entire living room, chemistry sets that, in a more cautious era, would not have included the things they included. Bicycles in red and turquoise, roller skates with metal wheels, board games whose boxes showed families laughing in ways that suggested the game had never, in any household, caused an argument. And sitting at the kitchen table in October, circling items with a practiced, hopeful urgency, every child was engaged in the most ancient of seasonal rituals, writing the list of things they would probably not get but absolutely needed. The full catalogue's toy section was, for many American children of the 1950s, the single most important document that arrived in their home all year. Not the school calendar, not the church bulletin, the toy section. It was studied with an intensity that teachers of the era could only have dreamed of redirecting toward academic subjects. Item numbers were memorized. Prices were noted and quietly assessed against what was known or suspected about the household's financial situation. The hierarchy of desires was carefully maintained. The thing you wanted most, the thing you wanted second most, the acceptable alternatives, the things you circled because they were there and you were circling things, all of it organized in your mind with an efficiency that would have impressed a logistics professional. The toy section also served as an annual record of what American culture had decided children should want. In the early 1950s, cowboys were everything. Roy Rogers and Gene Autry were on television and on lunch boxes, and now on the catalogue pages in the form of full cowboy sets, hat, vest, holster, cap gun, bandana, that allowed a child in a suburban backyard to spend an entire Saturday afternoon being somewhere dramatically different. By the mid-1950s, space had arrived. Rocket ships, toy satellites, ray guns in silver and red. The catalogue reflected the culture's shifting obsessions with a fidelity that made it, in retrospect, a fascinating historical document dressed up as a shopping guide. Train sets occupied a peculiar position in the toy section, technically toys, but sold with an earnestness that suggested they were also something else, something for fathers who were shopping for their sons but were going to be very involved in the setup process. Lionel trains were the prestige brand, but the catalogue offered its own line of electric trains that arrived in boxes with diagrams of track configurations that got increasingly complex the more you were willing to spend. There was always a father somewhere in America on Christmas Eve assembling a train set at 11:30 at night, consulting a diagram under a lamp that was too dim for the purpose, with a glass of something helpful nearby, absolutely certain that all the pieces were there and equally certain that one of them was missing. For girls, the doll section was its own small universe. Dolls that cried. Dolls that drank from tiny bottles and then wet their diapers, which was either a marvel of engineering or a harbinger of real life, depending on your perspective. Dolls with wardrobes, dolls with names. By the late 1950s, a new doll was about to arrive in American culture that would redefine the category entirely, but in the years just before her, the catalogue offered dolls that were resolutely childlike and domestic, practicing the rituals of nurturing and household management that the catalogue and the culture around it considered the appropriate preparation for a girl's future. It was a specific vision. It was the vision of the time, and then December 25th arrived, and the boxes were opened, and whatever was inside was real now, was here, was yours. And for one morning at least, the catalogue's promise and the living room floor were the same place. The catalogue was not just for suburban homes with 2 cars and a TV antenna. It served rural America deeply, faithfully, and with the specific understanding that a farmer needed a carbide lamp and a fence stretcher and a pair of overalls that could survive contact with an actual working day. The farm and garden section of a 1950s Sears catalogue is a document of a way of life that urban Americans were already beginning to romanticize from a distance, while the people actually living it were just trying to get a good price on seed grain, garden hoses, wheelbarrows, irrigation tubing, chicken wire in bulk rolls, hand pumps for wells, churn paddles for butter. The descriptions were practical and unromantic, written for people who needed information, not atmosphere. 5-gallon galvanized steel bucket, heavy duty, rust resistant. That's it. That's the whole description. No lifestyle implications. No suggestion that this bucket would improve your morning. Just a bucket. And it probably lasted 30 years. The farm and garden section existed in a register so different from the rest of the catalogue that it might as well have been a separate publication. Where the appliance pages spoke in the language of aspiration, and the clothing section dealt in the vocabulary of self-presentation, the farm section operated entirely in the currency of function. Things either did their job or they didn't. Things were either priced fairly or they weren't. There was no lifestyle being sold here, no vision of who you could become with the right equipment. You were already who you were. You had 400 acres and a broken cultivator, and a very specific need for a replacement part that the local hardware store did not stock. The catalogue had it. Page 387. Order it. The overalls deserve particular attention because they were, in the farm and garden section, what the craftsman wrench was in the tool section. A reliable, no-nonsense staple that people ordered year after year, with the quiet loyalty of someone who has found something that works and sees no reason to experiment. Denim bib overalls in blue or white stripe, sized by chest and inseam, made to withstand the specific physical abuse of farm work, the kneeling in mud, the catching on wire fencing, the pockets being filled with tools and seed packets, and the occasional small creature that needed temporary transporting. They were not fashionable. Nobody was under any impression that they were fashionable. They were the right garment for the work, sold at the right price, described in precisely the number of words the subject required, which was not many. Fencing materials occupied pages and pages of the farm section, and were sold with a specificity that made the eye water slightly if you had not grown up thinking seriously about fences. Woven wire, barbed wire, and smooth wire were all distinct products with distinct applications. Fence posts came in wood or steel. Post drivers were sold alongside the posts. Staples for attaching wire to wood posts were sold separately from clips for attaching wire to steel posts. Every component of the fencing system was available, individually, from the same catalogue, which meant that a farmer building or repairing fencing could order everything from a single source and expect it to arrive in coordinated shipments. This was not romantic. It was enormously useful, in the way that things that actually solve real problems are enormously useful, quietly and without ceremony. The garden section, as distinct from the farm section, offered a slightly softer version of the same practical efficiency. Seed packets, gardening gloves, hand trowels and cultivators, hoses in various lengths with various nozzle attachments described in terms of their spray pattern width and pressure capacity. Lawn mowers, by mid-decade, were beginning the transition from push-reel models to powered versions, and the catalogue charted this transition faithfully. The reel mowers still present, the new power mowers arriving alongside them, each one described with careful attention to cutting width and engine size, as though helping you understand what you were choosing and why it was worth the price difference. It was the farm and garden section's version of the catalogue's deepest impulse. Here is the thing. Here is what it does. Here is what it costs. You decide. The 1950s was, among other things, an era of spectacular babies. The post-war baby boom was in full swing, which meant that the baby section of the catalogue was not a modest afterthought, but a serious operational department staffed by people who understood that new parents are both exhausted and extremely susceptible to the argument that this specific item will make things easier. You're expecting. You're enormous and tired and mildly terrified, and someone has given you a catalogue with a helpful note that the baby section starts on page 244. You sit down. You open to page 244. There's a photograph of a crib that is so clean and so white and so bathed in gentle light that it looks less like furniture and more like a vision of the kind of sleep everyone in this household is about to stop having. You circle it immediately. Then you circle the matching dresser. Then the bassinet. Then you circle a little knitted sweater set in yellow, because you don't know yet. And yellow works for either. And it is very small and very soft, and something about the smallness of it makes your chest do a thing it does sometimes now, quiet and enormous. The baby section of a 1950s catalogue operated on a very specific understanding of its audience. People who were new to this and afraid of doing it wrong. The descriptions were gentle but authoritative, written in a voice that said, "We have thought about this carefully, and here is what you need," in a tone that was reassuring without being condescending. The crib had corner posts of a specific height, so that a swaddle blanket could not catch and cause harm. The mattress was of a specific firmness, described in language that made firmness sound like a gift rather than a hardship. The fitted sheet was the kind that stayed tucked even when a small person spent the night rotating slowly, which they would, which every small person does, which is simply what small people do. The layette, that wonderful old word for the complete set of clothing and linens assembled for a new baby, was available in the catalogue as a curated collection or as individual pieces to be assembled at the buyer's discretion. The catalogue layette included undershirts that tied at the side because buttons were difficult on a newborn and snaps had not yet fully taken over. It included gowns with an open bottom hem that allowed for diaper changes with a minimum of undressing, a design so sensible that it is hard to believe it required inventing. Nightgowns in soft flannel, receiving blankets in sets of 3 because you would always need one more than you thought. Knitted booties that would stay on a baby's feet for approximately 4 minutes before being kicked into the corner, where they would remain until someone stepped on them in the dark. The catalogue also offered equipment with the same practical efficiency it brought to everything else. Bathtubs sized for infants. Not the full bathtub, obviously, but a small plastic basin that could be set inside the kitchen sink at a comfortable height, which was the 1950 solution to the problem of bathing a small person without ruining your back. Bottle warmers for the mothers who were not nursing, sold with brisk neutrality and no commentary on the choice. Bottle sterilizers, a small countertop unit that used steam, sold with the implicit message that the bacteria in unsterilized bottles were a genuine threat that a responsible parent would take steps to address. High chairs in wood, painted white, with a removable tray and a footrest, designed with the understanding that babies spent a great deal of time trying to get out of high chairs and needed to be provided no assistance in that effort. And somewhere in the baby section, always, was the lullaby of catalogue commerce at its most tender. Tiny things at small prices for the smallest people, purchased by the most hopeful version of the buyer who had circled every item on the page with a pencil held very carefully, as though the act of circling was itself a form of preparation for the thing that was coming, enormous and small and entirely unknown. Here is the part where the catalogue becomes genuinely dangerous. Not the toy section, not the appliances, the credit program. By the 1950s, Sears had developed a system of installment credit that was, in the most generous possible interpretation, a way of making goods accessible to families who needed them. And in the less generous interpretation, which is also accurate, it was a masterwork of behavioral economics that understood, decades before behavioral economics had a name, that people will buy significantly more things if you break the price into small, manageable numbers and put them in a different part of the sentence from the total. This refrigerator does not cost $240. It costs $16 a month for 18 months. These are mathematically equivalent statements. They do not feel equivalent. One of them makes you wince and close the catalogue. The other one makes you reach for the order form. Sears understood this. Sears built an empire on this. And in 1950-something kitchen tables across America, families were quietly building small, manageable mountains of installment debt, one catalogue page at a time. The history of consumer credit in America is long and complicated and somewhat uncomfortable, and the Sears catalogue is near the centre of it. The company had been offering installment payment plans since the early 20th century, but the post-war era supercharged the system. Returning veterans were buying houses and furnishing them. Young families needed everything at once: furniture, appliances, linens, tools, clothing, baby equipment, and had neither the savings nor the patience to acquire it slowly. The catalogue installment plan offered a solution that felt almost too good. Get the thing now, pay for it over time, in amounts small enough to be absorbed into a monthly budget without causing the kind of sharp financial pain that makes people reconsider. The Sears Easy Payment Plan, as it was marketed, made the catalogue's most expensive items suddenly accessible to a much larger customer base. An automatic washer that cost more than most families earned in a month became, through the alchemy of installment credit, something you could acquire for the price of a dinner out per week. The psychological shift was real and immediate. Items that had lived permanently on the wish side of the catalogue, circled and recircled over multiple seasons, admired and set aside, suddenly migrated to the order form side. The pencil circle became a filled-out form and a signature on a credit agreement, and the item arrived 6 weeks later with a small additional card detailing your payment schedule, which you tucked into the kitchen drawer next to the other payment schedules. The interest rates on these arrangements were not always prominently displayed. This was, charitably, an era before consumer credit disclosure requirements reached their current form, and the catalogue did not go out of its way to emphasise the total cost of credit. The monthly payment was the number in large print. The interest cost was findable, but you had to look for it, and if you were excited about the automatic washer, you might not look very hard. This is not unique to the 1950s. It is not unique to Sears. It is simply how credit has always worked on the human mind, and Sears was among the first companies to build an entire retail strategy around that fact. What the Easy Payment Plan also did, perhaps unintentionally or perhaps very intentionally, was create ongoing relationships. A customer with an open Sears credit account was a customer with a reason to keep the catalogue. A customer making monthly payments was a customer who thought about Sears every month when the statement arrived. The credit account was, functionally, a loyalty program before loyalty programs existed, binding customers to the catalogue through the pleasant but durable mechanism of an outstanding balance. You couldn't exactly leave when you still owed 3 payments on the refrigerator, and by the time the refrigerator was paid off, something else had caught your eye. The cycle, once begun, was surprisingly difficult to step off. Sears understood that too. This one sounds like a joke. It is not a joke. For several decades in the early 20th century, reaching into the post-war period in some forms, Sears sold houses by mail. Not a dollhouse, not a kit for a small outbuilding. An actual full-size live-in residential home, delivered in pieces by rail freight, with instructions for assembly. The Sears Modern Homes catalogue offered over 450 different models between 1908 and 1940, and tens of thousands of them were built across the United States. By the 1950s, the HomeKit program had wound down. but its legacy was still visible in neighbourhoods across the country. Those neat, solid, quietly proud craftsman bungalows and colonial revivals that look almost identical to each other because they were built from the same catalogue page by people who wanted a home and were willing to build it themselves. If you ever drive through an older American neighbourhood and notice a house that looks suspiciously well-proportioned and modest in a very specific way, there's a reasonable chance someone's grandfather assembled it from a crate. The Sears Kit Home program was, in its time, one of the more audacious things a retail company had ever attempted, and it worked. The concept was straightforward, even if the execution was staggering in scale. Design a range of home models, pre-cut all the lumber and materials to specification at the factory, ship everything by rail freight to the buyer's nearest station, and include a detailed instruction manual. The buyer arranged for local labour, or recruited family and neighbours, and built the house. The catalogue promised that an average house could be assembled in a matter of months, which was true if everything went right and optimistic if it didn't, which is the same promise all construction projects make and none of them keep. The range of models was genuinely impressive. You could order a simple 2-bedroom bungalow for a modest price, or you could order a multi-storey colonial revival with a proper foyer and a sleeping porch and a kitchen laid out for serious domestic operation. Each model was shown in the catalogue with a floor plan and an exterior illustration, rendered in the clean, confident lines of catalogue art that made everything look achievable and slightly better than real life. The names of the models were drawn from the American landscape and the American imagination: the magnolia, the elmwood, the crescent, the Barrington. Names that suggested neighbourhoods and respectability, and a kind of settled, permanent comfort that was, for many buyers, exactly the point. The kit homes were not cheap, but they were significantly less expensive than contractor-built homes of comparable size and specification, and the savings were real enough to matter to the working and middle-class families who were the catalogue's core audience. A family that could not afford to hire an architect and a full construction team could order a Sears home, arrange local labour for the foundation and framing and finish work, and end up with a structurally sound, well-designed house at a price that fit within their means. The catalogue democratised home ownership in a specific and practical way that housing policy would not catch up to for decades. Today, the remaining Sears Kit homes are a small cult obsession among architectural historians and curious homeowners who look at their older craftsman bungalow and wonder. Researchers have identified thousands of them still standing, in states from California to Maine, in neighbourhoods that have changed around them while they remained quiet and solid and stubbornly intact. There are websites dedicated to identifying them. There are homeowners who have found the original shipping manifest tucked inside a wall during renovation. There is something genuinely moving about this. The idea that an order form filled out in 1914 is still, more than a century later, standing in a neighbourhood, sheltering people, doing exactly what the catalogue promised it would do. The catalogue house outlasted the catalogue. It might outlast everything. Modern you does not understand returns. Modern you has been so thoroughly spoiled by prepaid labels and free return shipping, and the gentle reassurance that if you don't love it, just send it back, that the idea of a purchase being genuinely, legally, permanently yours the moment the box is opened feels almost inconceivable. But in the 1950s, catalogue returns were possible. Sears did have a satisfaction guarantee, and yet they required a level of effort that ensured most people simply did not bother. You had to repack the item, you had to fill out a return form, you had to bring it to the post office, you had to pay for return shipping, at least sometimes. You had to write a letter explaining the problem in clear, polite, specific terms, and then you waited. Again. The whole process took the better part of a month, and had the emotional texture of filing a formal complaint with a distant government department run by people who meant well but were very busy. Most people kept the wrong dress. Most people kept the beige substitute. Most people sighed once at the kitchen table and then found somewhere to put it. The Sears satisfaction guarantee was real and was not nothing. The company took it seriously as a point of competitive differentiation, and if you completed the return process correctly and sent everything back in acceptable condition, they would refund your money or exchange the item without significant resistance. The guarantee existed because Richard Sears had understood, back in the 1890s when he was selling watches by mail, that a customer who couldn't inspect the product before buying needed something else instead, needed to know that if the watch was wrong, they were not simply out the money. The guarantee was the substitute for the fitting room, for the ability to hold the thing in your hand before committing. It was trust, formalized. But trust formalized is not the same as trust made easy. The practical steps of executing a catalogue return in the 1950s were sufficiently demanding to function, in effect, as a deterrent. The return form had to be requested separately, because it was not included in the original shipment. You had to write a letter asking for one, which took time. Once you had the form, you completed it, explaining the reason for the return in the specific terms the form requested, which were several, and attached it to the package with appropriate postage calculated according to the same weight table system you'd already navigated once and did not particularly want to navigate again in the direction of inconvenience. Then you brought the package to the post office, which required either a car or someone with one, and handed it to a postal worker who gave you a receipt that you were supposed to keep in a safe place until the refund arrived, which would take additional weeks. The refund itself came in the form of a credit to your account or a mailed check, depending on how you had originally paid, and if anything in the chain went wrong, if your return got mislaid, if the form was incomplete, if the refund check went to the wrong address, you wrote another letter and waited. Most people kept the wrong dress. This is not a criticism of Sears or of the American consumer. It is simply a recognition that time and effort are real costs, and that a return process demanding significant quantities of both would naturally be used only when the stakes were high enough to justify it. The wrong colour? You kept it and called it close enough. The wrong size by 2 inches? You kept it and let out the seam. A cracked mixing bowl? You kept it and used the uncracked side. A broken washing machine? Now you wrote the letter. The line between endurance and action was drawn precisely where inconvenience became hardship, and most catalogue customers in the 1950s knew exactly where that line was and navigated it with the pragmatic patience of people who had been managing imperfect circumstances their entire lives. They kept the dress. They wore it to church. It looked fine, mostly. You want to understand why the catalogue mattered, really mattered, the way things matter when they're not optional. You have to leave the suburb. You have to go to the farm, the small town, the place where the nearest department store is an hour's drive on a road that ice makes impassable 3 months of the year. In rural America in the 1950s, the catalogue was not a convenience. It was infrastructure. It was access. A farmer's wife in rural Montana did not have the option of driving to a store to look at fabric samples. A family in rural Mississippi was not popping downtown to compare washing machine prices. The catalogue arrived in the mail, and it carried with it the entire material possibility of modern American life, presented democratically and shipped to wherever you happened to live. It was, in a real and practical sense, the engine of economic equality for people who would otherwise have been entirely dependent on whatever a local merchant chose to stock and whatever price he chose to charge. The catalogue said, "You deserve the same things as everyone else. You just have to wait 6 to 8 weeks." Before the catalogue, rural Americans shopped at general stores that operated with the pricing confidence of an establishment that had no competition for 30 miles in any direction. The markup on goods at a rural general store in the late 19th and early 20th century was substantial, sustained not by greed exactly, but by the simple logic of supply and distance. Bringing goods to remote locations cost money, and that cost was passed directly to customers who had no other options. Aaron Montgomery Ward's original insight, the one that launched the whole catalogue industry, was that this situation was wrong and also fixable. The fix required only a postal service willing to deliver packages and a customer base willing to trust a transaction they could not complete in person. Both of those things existed. The catalogue happened. By the 1950s, rural families had been shopping by catalogue for 2 or 3 generations, and the practice had become woven into the rhythms of rural domestic life with the same naturalness as canning season or the county fair. The spring catalogue arrived and you thought about seeds and planting and what the garden might need this year. The fall catalogue arrived and you thought about winter, about keeping everyone warm, about what needed replacing before the snow came. The Christmas catalogue arrived and you gathered the family around the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, and everyone had their turn with the pages, even the youngest ones who couldn't read yet but understood the pictures with perfect clarity. The catalogue also served a social function in rural communities that is easy to overlook from the outside. In a place where neighbours might be miles apart and a trip to town was an event requiring planning, the catalogue's arrival was a small but genuine occasion. Neighbours shared catalogues when one household's copy had worn out. Women compared notes on what they had ordered and what had arrived, and whether it was worth it. The catalogue created a common vocabulary of goods and prices and possibilities that connected people who were otherwise quite isolated, gave them something to talk about that was specific and current and real. This is what people mean when they say the catalogue served rural America, and it is not a small thing. It meant that a family on a farm in the middle of the country had access to the same goods at the same prices as a family in a Chicago suburb, with the same guarantee and the same pencil-circling ritual and the same 6 weeks of waiting. It meant that distance was not destiny. It meant that the material conditions of a good life, warm clothes, reliable tools, a working kitchen, were available to anyone who could fill out an order form. The catalogue did not fix everything about rural poverty or rural isolation, but it fixed this one specific thing, and in fixing it, it changed what rural American life was capable of being. Sears and Montgomery Ward were the giants, but they weren't alone for long. By the 1950s, the catalogue marketplace had become genuinely crowded, and competing with the 2 heavyweights required a certain creative determination. J.C. Penney had a catalogue, Alden's had a catalogue, Spiegel had a catalogue, National Bellas Hess had a catalogue. Each one had its own personality, its own strengths, its own slightly different way of describing a blouse. Spiegel leaned slightly more fashionable, aiming at women who like to think of themselves as having a certain taste, even while ordering by mail. Alden's was aggressively affordable, the kind of catalogue that operated on the belief that a good price was its own form of elegance. And each household that received multiple catalogues engaged in a small but meaningful ritual of comparison, holding 2 photographs of nearly identical cotton house dresses side by side, examining the button quality in the descriptions, weighing a difference of 49 cents against a difference in shipping time. It was consumer research. It was also deeply satisfying in a way that has something to do with choice and human dignity that economists probably have a name for. Spiegel deserves particular attention because it occupied a specific and interesting position in the catalogue landscape. Where Sears was comprehensive and Ward's was reliable, Spiegel was aspirational in a softer, more fashion-conscious way. Its clothing pages had a slightly more polished aesthetic. The models were photographed with just a little more attention to mood and atmosphere, and the descriptions deployed the language of style with a confidence that Sears, which was trying to be everything to everyone, could not quite replicate. A woman who ordered from Spiegel was, in some small way, making a statement about the kind of woman she considered herself to be. This is not rational, it is simply true. Retail has always operated partly in the currency of identity, and Spiegel understood its particular slice of the identity market with impressive clarity. JCPenney's catalogue was built on the company's existing reputation for reliable, honest, fairly priced goods, the same values that drove its physical stores. Where Sears could sometimes feel slightly overwhelming in its scale and Spiegel could feel slightly out of reach in its aspirations, Penny's catalogue felt steady and trustworthy in the way of a store where you already knew what you were going to get and were confident it would be fine. This was not glamorous, it was valuable. A large portion of catalogue shopping in the 1950s was not about aspiration or fantasy. It was about needing a thing and wanting to be confident that the thing would arrive and work and not require a letter to the return department. Penny's served that need with quiet competence. Alden's was the budget option, and it wore this identity without apology. Prices were lower, descriptions were terser, and the photographs were taken in a light that suggested the photographer had a lot of items to get through and not a lot of afternoon left. But the goods were functional, and the prices were genuinely lower, and for a household operating on a tight budget in 1953, the difference between the Sears price and the Alden's price on a pair of children's winter boots was a real difference that made a real decision. Alden's served families who needed the catalogue's promise most, and had the least room for the catalogue's occasional disappointments. You ordered from Alden's because you needed to, and when it worked, when the boots arrived and fit and kept the children's feet dry all winter, it worked with the simple satisfaction of a practical problem solved at an honest price. The competition between all these catalogues produced something genuinely good for the American consumer, a marketplace where price, quality, and service were in continuous low-grade competition, where no single company could afford to stop improving because the others were always right there, also arriving in the mailbox, also laying their pages open on the kitchen table, also asking for the pencil and the order form and the 6 to 8 weeks of hopeful waiting. It was commerce done through paper and postage, across distances that still feel vast, and it worked with a thoroughness that the companies involved probably did not fully appreciate while they were doing it. It took a mall to interrupt it, and even then it took a while. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment, quiet and a little complicated. The catalogue was a dream delivery system, that much is obvious. But whose dreams? The photographs in a 1950s Sears catalogue showed a very specific vision of American life. White, suburban, tidy, prosperous, nuclear. The families in those photographs lived in homes that were perpetually clean and fully furnished and lit by a golden light that does not exist anywhere in nature. The women wore pressed house dresses, the men had good posture, the children were wholesome in a way that suggested they had never once argued at dinner, and the catalogue offered you, the reader, the tools to build this life, or at least the material components of it, the right appliances, the right furniture, the right linens, as if the correct mixer would produce the correct marriage. It was seductive. It was also a very specific story about what a good American life looked like, told in 600 pages, repeated twice a year, shipped to tens of millions of homes. The living room section of the catalogue was where this vision reached its most concentrated and deliberate form. The living room was the room that faced outward, the room that guests saw, the room that said something to the world about who lived behind the front door. And the catalogue furnished it accordingly. Sofas in tasteful neutrals, coffee tables with clean lines, matching armchairs positioned at the precise angle that suggested conversation without demanding it. Floor lamps with shades the colour of warm butter, casting a circle of light that implied evenings of calm domesticity, reading, perhaps, or the quiet hum of the television in the corner. Every element of the catalogue living room was arranged to communicate a specific message, and the message was stability, comfort, arrival. What the catalogue living room did not contain was mess. There were no stacks of mail on the coffee table, no shoes by the door, no half-finished projects claiming the armchair, no children's toys migrating across the carpet. The catalogue living room existed in a permanent state of readiness, as though company was expected momentarily and had been expected momentarily for years. This was, of course, the nature of photography and styling and commercial art. You show the best possible version of the thing you are selling. But when that best possible version is shown to millions of people twice a year, across an entire decade, it accumulates a certain cultural weight. People began to measure their living rooms against the catalogue living room and find them wanting in ways they might not have noticed before the catalogue showed them the comparison. This is one of the more complicated gifts the catalogue gave the 1950s American consumer, a standard. Standards are useful because they give you something to aim for. They are also, in the wrong light, a persistent source of low-grade dissatisfaction with whatever you currently have. The catalogue's living room was always slightly better than yours, slightly cleaner, slightly better coordinated, slightly more at peace with itself. And the catalogue was always there, in the house, reminding you of the gap. The solution it offered was conveniently also available for order. 16 easy payments. The racial composition of the catalogue's imagined America is worth naming directly, because it is part of the historical record and part of what the catalogue communicated silently and relentlessly to everyone who opened it. In the 1950s, the people in catalogue photographs were almost exclusively white. The vision of the good American life that the catalogue constructed and distributed to tens of millions of homes was a vision that did not include Black Americans, Latino Americans, or anyone outside a very specific demographic imagination. This was not incidental. It was a choice made by real people, repeated across thousands of photographs over many years. Black Americans ordered from catalogues too. The catalogue was one of the few retail institutions that served them on formally equal terms, with the same prices and the same guarantee regardless of the buyer's address or identity. But the dream the catalogue sold, the visual language of American prosperity and comfort, was not built in their image. That absence was its own kind of statement, and it was heard. The catalogue reflected the culture that produced it. That is what documents do. And the 1950s America it reflected was a specific place with specific values and specific blind spots, some of which have been corrected and some of which are still being worked on. Holding the catalogue accountable for its era does not diminish what it accomplished. It simply makes the picture complete. The 1950s gave America two things simultaneously that were both about sitting inside and wanting things: the television and the catalogue. And while they seem like different animals, one loud and electric, one silent and paper, they were doing remarkably similar work on the American consumer psyche at the same moment in history. Television showed you how people lived, or rather, how television decided people lived. In clean houses with good furniture and appliances that worked perfectly, and families who solved their problems in 22 minutes. The catalogue offered you the means to acquire the physical stuff of that life. Together, they created a feedback loop of aspiration and consumption that would define American consumer culture for decades. You watched a family on television sit around a kitchen table with a particular kind of mixer on the counter. You turned to the catalogue. You found that mixer. It was on page 312. It came in 3 colours. There was an instalment plan. The pencil was already behind your ear. Television arrived in American homes with extraordinary speed. In 1948, fewer than 2% of American households had a television set. By 1955, that number was over 60%. By the end of the decade, television was in nearly every American living room, and its influence on how Americans understood their own lives was total and immediate in the way that only a medium which you watch in your own home in your own chair for several hours every evening can be. Television was intimate. It spoke to you from inside your house. It showed you people living lives that looked like yours, but better lit and more resolved, and it did this every single night. The sitcom families of the 1950s are well known enough to be cultural shorthand even today. The tidy house, the patient mother in the pressed dress, the reasonable father with a good job, the children with their manageable problems. What is less often noted is that these families lived in fully furnished homes that were, set designers and prop masters ensuring this carefully, stocked with current appliances and modern furniture. The kitchen on a popular family sitcom was not a random collection of props. It was a carefully assembled vision of what a modern American kitchen looked like, complete with identifiable appliance models that real American households might recognize and covet. Television and catalogue were, in this way, in silent collaboration, one creating the desire, one offering the fulfillment. The television itself, of course, was available in the catalogue, and the television section of a 1950s Sears catalogue is a fascinating document of a technology moving so fast that the catalogue could barely keep pace with it. Early television sets were enormous cabinets with small screens. The furniture dominated the technology, as though the set needed to look like a respectable piece of furniture in order to earn its place in the living room. By the mid-1950s, the screens were growing and the cabinets were shrinking, and the catalogue dutifully updated its offerings every season, each new model described with the breathless optimism of people living through a genuine revolution in home entertainment who were not yet tired of being amazed by it. Buying a television from the catalogue was a specific kind of transaction, because the television was, for most families, the single most expensive item they had ever ordered by mail. It required the instalment plan almost by necessity. The prices were beyond what most households could absorb in a single payment, and it arrived in a box of alarming size that required 2 people to carry and a moment of serious domestic renegotiation to position. Where does the television go? This question reorganized American living rooms. Furniture that had been arranged for conversation was rearranged for viewing. The fireplace, which had been the traditional focal point of the family room, found itself competing with a cabinet containing a glowing rectangle and lost. The catalogue sold you the television. The television rearranged your house. The catalogue then sold you the new furniture arrangement. The loop was perfect and entirely unplanned and very, very good for business. What television and catalogue together accomplished was the creation of a national consumer culture operating at scale and speed that had not existed before. Regional differences in taste, in domestic style, in the specific objects people surrounded themselves with, began to soften as the same catalogue pages and the same television programs reached from Maine to California, showing everyone the same version of the American living room and offering everyone the same pencil and order form path toward it. This is not a simple good or a simple harm. It is simply what happened in the 1950s in millions of homes, one evening at a time. The full catalogue arrived in September or October and was treated for the month between its arrival and December 25th, with the kind of sustained, obsessive attention that children today give to YouTube videos about other children unboxing toys. It was studied. It was memorized. Pages were turned so many times that the corners softened and the spine developed a personality. Specific items were looked at daily, not to gather more information. The information had been gathered and catalogued in a child's mind with archival precision, but for the simple comfort of looking. You knew the price. You knew the item number. You'd committed the product description to memory, including the subordinate clause about the recommended age range that you had decided did not apply to you. And in the quiet weeks before Christmas, The catalogue was a kind of comfort object. Proof that the thing you wanted existed, that it had been manufactured by someone and photographed and given a name, and that somewhere it was waiting, in a warehouse, for someone to order it and send it to the right address. The annual ritual of the Christmas list began, for most children, with the catalogue. Not with a conversation, not with a letter to Santa. The catalogue came first, because the catalogue showed you what existed and therefore what was possible to want. Before you saw it in the pages, you could not want it specifically. The catalogue converted vague, seasonal desire into precise consumer demand, which is a remarkable thing to do to a 7-year-old with a pencil and unlimited hope. You flip through the toy section with the focused intensity of someone taking inventory of everything the world was withholding from you. And by the time you reached the end, you had a list that was equal parts sincere wish and optimistic overreach. The list itself was a negotiated document. There was the honest list, the one in your head, containing the 3 things you actually wanted most, ordered by desire, and the diplomatic list, the one you presented to adults, which had been edited for plausibility and strategic price pointing. You knew, by a certain age, that the train set that filled half a page and cost what your father made in a week was not a realistic request. You put it on the list anyway, in the understanding that it served as the anchor, the thing that made everything else look reasonable by comparison. The electric football game was still expensive, but compared to the train set, it looked almost modest. This was not calculation exactly. It was the instinctive economics of a child who'd been paying attention. Parents had their own relationship with the Christmas catalogue, and it was primarily characterised by the arithmetic of expectation management. You looked at the circled pages. You noted the prices. You did the mental math of several children's lists against a single household budget and arrived at a set of decisions that required the kind of philosophical equanimity usually found only in people who've been through something genuinely difficult. Some items were possible, some were not. Some were possible if you ordered in October and used the instalment plan and did not think too hard about January. You ordered what you could. You wrapped it. You put it under the tree. On Christmas morning, the catalogue's promise and the living room floor occupied the same space for the first and only time. Things that had existed only as photographs and item numbers and pencil circles were suddenly real and present and slightly different from how they had looked on the page. Slightly smaller, or a different shade of the described colour, or accompanied by an instruction sheet that was optimistic about the assembler's mechanical aptitude. And yet, they were here. They were real. The waiting was over. The child sitting on the floor in the early morning light, still in pyjamas, holding the thing that had lived in the catalogue for 3 months, was experiencing something that the adult brain eventually forgets, and the child brain holds with perfect clarity. The moment when something you wanted very much turns out to actually exist. It is one of the better feelings available. The catalogue gave it to an entire generation, twice a year, reliably, for decades. There is a moment somewhere in the 1950s when the catalogue stops being a primarily rural institution and becomes simply an American one. As suburban sprawl pushed new housing developments outward from city centres into territories that had the infrastructure of suburbs, but the convenience desert geography of rural land, the catalogue found a new audience. Young families in new houses on new streets, where the nearest department store was a car ride away, and the car was sometimes shared. These were not farmers. These were office workers and factory workers and nurses and teachers who had just moved into a 3-bedroom house with a yard and needed to fill it with things, quickly, because the moving boxes were still sitting in the corner and company was coming Sunday. The catalogue was there. It had always been there. But now it was there for them, for this new version of American life being invented in real time by people who were making up the rules as they went along, circling items in the houseware section, planning a home they were still figuring out how to live in. The suburban expansion of the 1950s was one of the largest and fastest transformations of the American physical landscape in history. Levittown in New York, completed in the late 1940s, became the model. Identical houses built quickly on cleared farmland, sold to returning veterans and their growing families at prices that, combined with the GI Bill's mortgage assistance, were within reach of people who had never previously imagined owning a home. The houses were small, the lots were modest, the streets were new enough that the sidewalk still smelled of fresh concrete, and every family that moved in brought almost nothing, because they had not previously lived in a house that belonged to them and had not accumulated the things that houses require. The catalogue understood this before anyone formally identified it as a market. Sears began promoting its catalogue specifically to new suburban homeowners in the early 1950s, and the response confirmed what the company had intuited. These families needed everything at once, had limited time to shop in person, and were operating in neighbourhoods where retail infrastructure had not yet caught up to residential density. The nearest department store might be 30 minutes away. The nearest hardware store might not yet exist. But the catalogue was in the mailbox every season, containing every category of household need in a single organised document with a payment plan and a guarantee. What changed when the catalogue acquired a suburban audience was the specific nature of what got circled. Rural customers had been ordering practical goods, work clothing, farm equipment, basic appliances for generations. Suburban customers wanted those things too, but they also wanted something the catalogue had always quietly offered, but now found itself selling in much larger quantities. The look of a life assembled with intention. Decorative items, matching sets, things that served no purely functional purpose but contributed to the specific feeling of a home that had been thought about, chosen, curated. Curtain rods and curtains in a complementary print, a set of kitchen canisters in a coordinating colour, a welcome mat, a clock for the wall above the stove. Small things, inexpensive individually, collectively the difference between a house that felt temporary and a house that felt like someone lived in it on purpose. The catalogue also helped suburban families navigate a new and somewhat bewildering social landscape. The suburb of the 1950s was a community of strangers who had arrived simultaneously from different places, different backgrounds, different ways of doing things, and were now living 12 feet apart and expected to get along. What you put in your living room and on your front porch and in your garden was a communication to neighbours who did not yet know you. The catalogue provided a shared visual language, goods that were widely distributed and therefore mutually recognisable, that said middle class, American, settled, decent, in a new community that was still building the social fabric through which such things are normally communicated. The catalogue was, in this particular sense, a tool of belonging. You ordered from it. Your neighbour ordered from it. You recognised each other's curtains. You had something to talk about. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, something was changing. Shopping malls were appearing on the edges of American cities with a speed and confidence that suggested they knew exactly what they were doing, which was to give Americans the experience of wanting and buying things in a new and immediate way that the catalogue, with its 6 to 8 week timeline and its pencil arithmetic, could not replicate. You could walk into a store and touch the dress. You could see the colour in real light rather than in catalogue photography light, which was its own kind of light with its own kind of agenda. You could leave with a thing the same day, which turned out to matter more than anyone had realised until it was an option. The catalogue didn't die. Not yet. Not for a long time. But it began the slow, complicated process of figuring out what it was in a world where you could also just go to the mall. It would adapt. It would survive longer than anyone expected. But something had shifted. The same way something always shifts when a new convenience appears. and the old one realises it has to earn its place again. The shopping mall did not arrive gently. It arrived with parking lots and anchor department stores and food courts, and a climate-controlled interior that suggested all the pleasures of shopping had been organised under one roof specifically for your convenience. The first modern enclosed mall, Southdale Center in Edina, Minnesota, opened in 1956, and the design concept it introduced, enclosed, climate-controlled, combining retail with leisure and food in a single destination, spread with extraordinary speed. By the early 1960s, malls were appearing in suburbs across the country, each one presenting itself as the solution to the specific problem that suburban life had created. You have money, you want things, and everything is far away. The mall collapsed the distance. It made everything immediately available and immediately returnable, and immediately comparable in ways the catalogue simply could not match. What the mall had that the catalogue would never have was the body's experience of shopping. The weight of fabric in your hand, the smell of a shoe store, the specific satisfaction of a dressing room mirror that flatters in a way your bathroom mirror does not. The impulse purchase made while walking past a display that you had not specifically come for and did not specifically need and bought anyway, because it was there and it was 15% off, and something about it appealed to you in the moment, which is an experience that requires physical presence and cannot be replicated by a pencil circle on a catalogue page. Shopping in person engaged senses that mail-order commerce could not touch, and once those senses had been engaged, once Americans had experienced the immediate gratification of leaving a store with a bag in hand, on the same day the desire arose, the 6 to 8 weeks of catalogue waiting felt longer than it had before. Sears responded in the way large institutions respond to threats to their core business, by not quite believing it was a threat, then adapting slowly, then adapting faster, then transforming in ways that were sometimes successful and sometimes not. The catalogue continued through the 1960s and 1970s and into the 1980s, growing in some periods and shrinking in others, becoming more specialised as the general merchandise market migrated toward physical retail. Sears invested heavily in its physical stores, eventually becoming one of the country's largest department store chains, and the catalogue became, for a time, less the primary business and more the complement to it, a way of reaching customers who couldn't or wouldn't come to the store, a channel for items too large or specialised to stock in every location. But the cultural moment had passed. The catalogue as a way of life, as the wish book, as the twice-yearly arrival that reorganised the household's desires and the family's Sunday afternoons, that moment belonged to the specific decades when it had no competition, when it was not one option among many but simply the way things worked. The people who grew up with it, who had pressed their finger to the toy section at age 7, and learned to fill out an order form at 14, and placed their first independent order as a young adult with a new apartment, and a list of things it needed. Those people carried the catalogue's rhythms inside them in a way that did not transfer to their children, who had malls, and did not transfer to their grandchildren, who had the internet, which is just the catalogue again, running at the speed of right now, with free returns, which is everything the catalogue wanted to be, and several things it never quite managed. The catalogue is mostly gone now. The wish book was discontinued by Sears in 1993. Other catalogues followed. Some persist in specialised forms: the seed catalogue, the specialty outdoor retailer, the kitchen supply company, small descendants of the original, serving the specific rather than the comprehensive. But the great general merchandise catalogue, the 600-page twice-yearly delivery of everything, the document around which families organise their desires and their kitchen tables, that is finished. What remains is the memory of it, carried by the people who used it, and the houses some of their grandparents built from crates, standing quietly in neighbourhoods that have changed around them, solid and well-proportioned and ordered from a page, still there, still doing exactly what was promised, long after the promise was made. Let's slow down for a moment and talk about who was actually running the catalogue economy, because it wasn't the men in the automotive section, and it wasn't the children in the toy section, though both of them had opinions. It was women. Specifically, it was American women in their 20s, 30s and 40s, managing households of considerable complexity on budgets that required careful attention, making purchasing decisions that affected every person under their roof, and doing all of this with a document that was, in effect, their primary retail interface with the wider world. The catalogue was, in its bones, a tool built for and operated by women, and the women who used it were not passive consumers drifting dreamily through pages of pretty things. They were managers. They were negotiators. They were people who knew the price of everything in the housewares section and could tell you, without looking, whether the Ward's price or the Sears price on a set of bath towels was better value when you factored in the shipping weight differential. This was not shopping. This was procurement, and it was done mostly by women who received no particular credit for being extraordinarily good at it. The post-war American household was, by any reasonable measure, a small organisation. It had a budget, a supply chain, a maintenance schedule, a feeding requirement, a clothing requirement, and a set of long-term capital investments. The appliances, the furniture, the occasional piece of equipment that needed to be planned and timed and financed with care. The woman managing this organisation was doing work that, in a commercial context, would have been called operations management, and she was doing it without a title, without a salary, and without anyone formally acknowledging that it was skilled labour requiring genuine expertise. The catalogue was one of her primary tools, and the expertise she brought to using it, the knowledge of sizing, of shipping weights, of which product descriptions could be trusted and which were optimistic, of when to order early and when to wait for the sale catalogue, was real expertise, accumulated over years of practice and refined through experience. What the catalogue also gave women, in ways that are easy to underestimate from a distance of 70 years, was a domain of autonomous decision-making in an era when women's autonomy in other areas was considerably constrained. A woman could not, in most states in the 1950s, open a bank account without her husband's signature. She could not apply for a credit card in her own name. She could not easily own property independently or sign a contract without male co-signature. But she could fill out a catalogue order form. She could decide what the household needed, assess the options, make a selection, and complete a transaction. The catalogue account, in many households, was effectively hers, managed by her, used by her, understood by her in ways that her husband often was not interested in replicating. It was a small domain of authority in an era of limited domains, and it was exercised with the competence and seriousness it deserved. The catalogue also served as a quiet education in the economics of household management. Women who ordered regularly developed an intuitive sense of quality-to-price relationships, of which categories of goods were worth ordering by mail and which required inspection in person, of how credit costs affected the real price of instalment purchases. This knowledge was passed between women, shared over kitchen tables, discussed at church socials, exchanged in the specific register of women talking about practical things in a world that sometimes treated practical things as unimportant. The catalogue created a community of informed consumers who happened to be women, who happened to be running households, who happened to be doing it largely without recognition. They kept the receipts, though. They always kept the receipts. There is a particular kind of writing that exists nowhere in the world except inside a mail-order catalogue, and once you learn to recognise it, you cannot stop noticing it. It is cheerful without being frivolous. It is specific without being technical. It is persuasive in the way of a very confident friend who has already bought the thing and wants you to understand why that was a good decision. It describes a 3/4-inch paintbrush, as though the 3/4-inch paintbrush has been waiting its entire life to be in your hand doing this particular job. It tells you that a cotton house dress is designed for easy movement and all-day comfort, as though movement and comfort were qualities that required intentional engineering, rather than simply the absence of whoever designed formal wear. The catalogue copywriter was a specific and largely unsung figure in the history of American advertising, and the language they developed, that warm, specific, quietly insistent prose, shaped the way Americans thought about objects and purchases and the relationship between the two in ways that are still visible today if you know where to look. Richard Sears himself was the first and in some ways the best catalogue copywriter, and the tradition he established in the 1880s persisted through the mid-20th century with remarkable consistency. His original copy was famously enthusiastic, occasionally running to paragraphs of breathless description for a single item, building a case for the product the way a lawyer builds a case for a client, with evidence, with enthusiasm, with a willingness to anticipate and address every possible objection before the reader had a chance to raise it. By the 1950s, the style had become more restrained, more professional, but the fundamental approach remained. Name the thing, describe what it does, explain why it does it better than not having it, close with the price and the assurance that the price is fair. The colour names deserve their own appreciation because they represent a minor art form within the larger art form of catalogue prose. Colours in a 1950s catalogue were never simply colours. They were colonial blue, which was blue but with authority. They were harvest gold, which was yellow but with ambition. They were forest green, dusty rose, pearl grey, autumn russet, morning mist, names that transformed a pigment decision into an atmospheric experience, that made choosing between two shades of beige feel like choosing between two moods, two seasons, two versions of your own domestic life. You were not picking a colour for your bedspread. You were deciding whether you were a dusty rose household or a colonial blue household, and that decision, the catalogue implied with perfect subtlety, said something real about who you were. The size and fit descriptions were another subspecialty. Describing how a garment fits without the customer being able to try it on is a genuinely difficult writing problem, and catalogue copywriters solved it with a combination of specific measurement information and carefully chosen adjectives that were technically accurate while being strategically optimistic. Roomy cut meant there was extra fabric. Relaxed fit meant there was more extra fabric. Generously proportioned meant the relationship between the garment and your actual body would be loose and somewhat unpredictable, but not technically the catalogue's fault. These were not lies. They were the vocabulary of a medium working within its limitations, choosing words that serve the transaction without actively deceiving the buyer, which is distinction that is real even if the margin is sometimes narrow. And then there were the aspirational lines, the ones that appeared at the end of product descriptions and did the emotional work that the specifications could not. Perfect for entertaining, a thoughtful gift, makes housework a pleasure, a touch of elegance for everyday living. These phrases were small and seemingly disposable, but they were doing something important, connecting the object to a feeling, to an occasion, to a version of life in which the object was not just useful but meaningful. The catalogue copywriter understood, without any formal theory to support the understanding, that people do not buy things. They buy what they imagine the things will make possible. And the last line of a catalogue description was where that imagination was gently, expertly invited in. And so here we are, at the end of a very long, very deliberate browse through one of the quieter revolutions in American life. No battles, no monarchs, no plagues or collapsing empires, just a catalogue, just a book that arrived twice a year on a front porch somewhere in America and quietly, persistently changed the way an entire nation thought about what it needed, what it wanted, and what the difference between those two things actually was. Think about what the people of the 1950s managed for a moment. They rebuilt their lives after a war that had taken nearly everything. They moved into new houses on new streets in new towns and filled those houses from scratch, one order form at a time, 6 to 8 weeks at a stretch. They measured themselves with tape measures held at awkward angles. They did shipping weight arithmetic in pencil on kitchen tables. They waited, patiently and impatiently, for boxes that sometimes held exactly what they hoped for, and sometimes held something close enough to keep. They raised children who grew up believing that the toy section of the full catalogue was the most important document produced by any civilization, anywhere, at any point in history. And they were not entirely wrong. They built something ordinary and something lasting, not pyramids, not cathedrals, just homes, filled with chosen things, ordered with intention, paid for in installments, used until they wore out or were replaced by something slightly better from the next catalogue. It was a modest kind of legacy, and it was also a profound one, because it was the legacy of people insisting, quietly and persistently, that a good and comfortable life was not a luxury reserved for the wealthy few, but a reasonable expectation, available by mail, delivered to your door, guaranteed to your satisfaction. So tonight, as you settle into your clean sheets and your climate-controlled room, with your phone charging on the nightstand and next-day shipping available at the touch of a screen, maybe spare a quiet thought for the woman in the kitchen with the stubby pencil, working through the weight table in 8-point font, circling things she needed and things she wanted, and a few things she simply liked the look of, in the warm light at the end of an ordinary day. She did not have it easy. She made it look easy, which is different and considerably harder. Sleep well. The catalogue will be there in the morning.